Today we're discussing this, the Canon C50. Now, I've only had this camera for a few days, so this won't be as thorough as my normal reviews, but I was able to test all the main sensor-related things that I was curious about. However, I would like to recommend and applaud CVP on their coverage of this camera. Their video is fantastic, and I'm sure will fill in any gaps that I've missed. Also, Canon did loan me this camera and asked that I mention it's a pre-production model, not a final version. That was the end of their input though. They haven't paid me for this coverage, nor do they get to review it before it goes live. This video doesn't have an official sponsor either, but is brought to you by my own undone LUTs, which have been updated to include this Canon C50. But I'll tell you more about my LUTs during the color section of this video, and would greatly appreciate you considering purchasing them if you find this video on the Canon C50 helpful. So let me just start by saying that I really like this camera. I think despite the complaints I've read about it missing certain features, it's positioned perfectly and offers an option for people like me who don't care about the stuff it's missing. But let's get that stuff out of the way first. It does not have a viewfinder, an IBIS module, a mechanical shutter, or built-in NDs. But if you consider this the little brother of the C80, that all makes sense. The C80 doesn't have any of those things either, except for the built-in NDs, but it also costs $2,000 more than this camera, as the C50 is currently priced at just $3,900. So I look at it more like, do you want a C80 but you don't need built-in NDs? Here, save $2,000 and get this. But on the other hand, if you want IBIS, a viewfinder, and a shutter, you can get the Canon R5 Mark II for roughly the same price when that camera's not on sale. Maybe the confusion started because this camera has a dedicated switch over to photo mode and a shutter button. I think it's cool that they added that in case you need to take occasional photos with this camera too, but I also would have been fine if they completely left it out, like on the C80. On social, I saw an influx of crazed people so angry it didn't have IBIS, but I've also heard from professional first ACs and camera techs that having IBIS in these compact cinema cameras is more of a problem than a solution. So if this is part of the cinema line, I think it makes sense to appeal to those customers who don't want to have to deal with an IBIS module. The FX6, C70, R5C, and most of Blackmagic's lineup don't have IBIS either. And again, for the customers who do need it, the R5 Mark II is fantastic. I'm instead impressed by the amount of Cineline features they were able to cram into this package while keeping the size reasonable, making it surprisingly light and comfortable in the hand. The LCD screen does feel a bit small when moving from a C80. That might be my only physical complaint, as it can be hard to read all the little details at times, but it's workable, and the HDMI output options are great if you need a bigger monitor. And unlike the R5C, this one features a full-size HDMI port. In fact, there's a laundry list of welcome inclusions and in some cases upgrades from the R5C that I noticed. Let me rattle some of them off for you now. You can map the back thumb wheel to ISO finally. That's something I've complained about on many Canon cameras, but the dial customization in general is really great on this camera. It has Canon Log 2. They added focus breathing correction. They added a line level option to the 3.5mm mic jack. In fact, the entire audio experience in this camera is fantastic. The XLR top handle is probably the best in the business for size and design, and the interface both internally and externally is robust and well laid out. It sounds great and works really well. I do wish that it had a 32-bit float option with dual ADCs to keep it on par with some of the recent competition, however. There's a great little zoom rocker that can be mapped to digital zoom as well if you're not using a power zoom lens. The USB-C port not only provides power delivery, but can now also function as a UVC stream port to make your camera detectable as a webcam when using just a USB cable. It has redundant recording and relay recording, and the camera doesn't turn off when you open the battery door, something that has annoyed me about many Canon cameras in the past. This means you can swap out the full card when it switches over for truly endless relay recording, which again is supported by the USB-C power delivery and the active cooling, giving you infinite runtime if needed. The fan is great and has a full range of controls over it. This thing just doesn't overheat. One thing to keep in mind though about that car door is that if you have it open, you can't charge your battery over USB-C. So while it doesn't shut down the camera, it does shut down charging. So don't forget that and leave your car door open thinking you're charging your camera and then come back a couple hours later and the battery is still dead. Battery life is also much improved compared to the R5C at launch as well. It's using the new P variant of the E6 battery. Now I've heard the R5C is getting better runtimes these days, but I haven't tested in a while. But what I can say is that the C50 recorded for 1 hour and 53 minutes of oversampled 4K XF AVC on a full charge, which is solid. The autofocus is fantastic, as we've come to expect from Canon, but now with a bonus addition. Typically only the photo modes got the animal tracking, and the cinema system was limited to more rudimentary human face tracking. While in the C50, they added animal detection to the cinema menu as well, which is appreciated, and that coupled with the face-only detection mode, which is now called detect only, and the addition of subject detection in 120p, makes this one of the most fleshed out cinema autofocus systems we've seen. It has all the tools you could want, like waveforms, false color, zebras, view assist, a level, peaking, the focus guide, frame markers, and so on. And a big selling point for many people is the inclusion of open gate recording. Something I've seen equal ranting about on social media. As much as people hate that this camera doesn't have IBIS, they seemingly hate cameras without open gate even more. Well, here you go, 7K open gate. We'll talk more about it in a second when we get to the sensor testing, but first, now that I've praised all the improvements, let me share with you a few gripes that I have with this camera, most of which are pretty trivial if I'm being honest. Let's start with the pettiest one of them all. My waveform size resets when I turn the camera off and back on. It goes back to the default size instead of the larger 2x size. Don't know if this is intentional or a bug, but I personally found it annoying. Secondly, there are plenty of tally lamps on this camera and the top handle, which is great, but there's not one on the record button. I think this would have been a nice inclusion to make it easier to find in the dark. I suppose you could just use the shutter button to start and stop recording to get around this issue, and it's probably just my experience with the Sony FX3 that left me wanting this feature on this camera. And finally, the playback screen still doesn't seem to allow the application of view assist when playing back log footage, and I still can't figure out a way to zoom in on clips during playback. Two features I wish Canon would consider adding. I do, however, once again want to praise how great it is that you can recover corrupted footage due to power loss directly in the playback menu quickly and easily in camera. That's awesome. And unforeseen power loss is mitigated by thoughtful inclusions of a time remaining display next to the battery icon and flashing tally lights with an on-screen warning when your battery gets critically low. Love that. Two other improvements that I should point out because I complained about them on other cameras. One, the photo video selector is now a lot better at landing on the exact thing you want. It doesn't switch easily from video to photo when you're actually trying to turn it off. It stops where you want it to stop, which is great. And the second thing is that the hot shoe cover is now a lot easier to remove and put back on without needing to finagle with that larger one from the previous cameras. All right, that's it for my mini review. Now let's go over the test results for the sensor, starting with rolling shutter. So let's start with that 6.9K open gate mode, the slowest mode on this camera, and we get a read time of 17.9 milliseconds. This is actually pretty solid. Usually I regard anything below 15 milliseconds as good enough, but for open gate, 18 milliseconds feels reasonable, especially because the more conventional aspect ratio RAW modes hit that sub 15 millisecond target, coming in at 14.3 milliseconds. And it stays the same whether you shoot at 60 frames per second or shoot in 4K XFAVC, which means that the 4K modes up to 60p are oversampled from that 6.9K RAW. That is unless you shoot in 120p, then it drops to 7.2 milliseconds, which also tells us that it's either not oversampled or at a lower bit depth because the framing doesn't change, but you can see much more noise in the 120p image. Also, accessing 120 frames per second is quite limited. You can only do it in the slow and fast mode, so it's pre-slowed footage, but you can't choose the S and F mode with audio. That one caps at 60p. So it's only a silent 4K pre-slowed down 120p with worse image quality. It's full frame, full width, which is cool, and I'm glad that it's there versus not existing at all. But something you're going to see me continually praise about this camera is its consistency, and that 120p is the only mode that doesn't qualify as consistent with the rest. I suppose that's a consequence of using such a high resolution sensor, so I'd think of it as a 60p camera with a bonus but reduced quality 120p mode. And you can't put the camera in Super 35 mode to fix the 120p issues because, interestingly, switching the camera over to Super 35 mode does not improve the read speed. It stays consistent at about 14.5 milliseconds whether in 5K RAW or 4K AVC, and that's because in this mode, rather than get a read speed benefit, we're getting a dynamic range boost instead. Very interesting choice from Canon, but let's look at the actual numbers for that. So for my dynamic range test, I use a chart called the Xyla21 and analysis software called Imatest. And along the top of the Imatest results page, we can see what mode I was shooting in. In this case, the 6.9K RAW at ISO 800 in Canon Log 2. This camera offers both Canon Log 2 and 3, but for maximum dynamic range, you'll want to use Canon Log 2. Then in the right corner besides slope-based DR is how many stops total the camera was able to discern. So in this case, 15 stops is advertised. Then below that, we have different noise tolerances. Usually we compare the medium score, which is a signal to noise ratio of 2, and that tells us how many stops are good and clean. And in 6.9K RAW, we get a score of 10.1. This isn't a great result, but we have to keep in mind that no noise reduction, IPB compression, or oversampling is applied to this footage. Now, the second native ISO on this camera has been increased to 6400, which I think will make low light shooters happy, but sadly we don't maintain our dynamic range perfectly at that second native. It drops about a stop down to 9 stops on the medium. But here's the interesting thing about the Super 35 I was mentioning. Switching to that mode bumps the total dynamic range up to 15.5 stops and the clean stops to 11. I like this. I like that you can trade in some field of view for more dynamic range if needed without changing your read speed. Now let's look at the non-RAW options. If you record the oversampled XFAVC in 4K, you keep your 15 stops total, but the medium jumps to 12.8. This would be the score to compare if you were looking at results from a Sony camera, which usually has noise reduction, compression, and oversampling already baked in. And in that comparison, this camera competes quite well with the best options from Sony like the Alpha 1, FX2, and FX3. But if you shoot XFAVC in the Super 35 mode, then it jumps to over 13 stops in the medium and beats most other cameras in a similar price range. You just have to deal with that crop. But shooting RAW still has its advantages. First, you can drop that 10-stop 6.9K RAW file on a 4K timeline and immediately gain a stop from oversampling with a medium score of 11. And then if you add some noise reduction yourself in post, you can easily achieve at least 12.5 stops while preserving more detail in the shadows than the comparable XFAVC image. So overall, the dynamic range on this camera is quite good and comparable with the best in the price bracket, but not quite as good as the more expensive cinema cameras. For comparison, within Canon, it's better than the R5C, but slightly worse than the C80, which again, logically aligns with its position in the market. As we move through the ISO range, two things are observable. You can see it clean up when switching from ISO 5000 to 6400, where the second native ISO clicks in, and the image stays quite clean up to ISO 12800 and then gets pretty noisy on its way to 25600. But back to my point about consistency, the color quality is maintained from ISO 800 all the way to 25600 with hardly any detectable green or magenta shifts. Color in general on this camera has been great. Strikes a great balance between pleasing and accurate, but still carries Canon's signature rosy skin tones. It's very, very close to the C80 if you've worked with that camera. You could probably cut between them with very minimal tweaks. But if you want perfect color on this camera, or you want to cut between other cameras within Canon or other camera brands entirely and want them all to match, I recommend my undone LUTs for that task. As I said in the intro, I've added the C50 to my Canon pack alongside the C80, R5, R5 Mark II, R6 Mark II, and I'll have an R5C and C70 version added later this month. Regardless of when you purchase the pack, any cameras I add in the future will be sent out as free upgrades, and I'm updating them all the time. What's great about my LUTs is that they're based on neutral exposure, meaning you don't have to over or underexpose your footage. You can just put on the in-camera view assist and expose naturally, and my LUTs will work perfectly. This means that all your camera tools like false color can be used without needing to compensate for my LUTs. And when you do apply them, you'll get extremely accurate color brought to a neutral middle ground that will match my LUTs for other camera brands as well. I include an LC version that matches the manufacturer's preferred 709 curve, but now with perfect color for a lower contrast look that you can tweak to taste, and then a regular version that has significantly more contrast for a finished look in just one step. And in the case of the Canon LUTs, I've included Canon Log 2, Canon Log 3, and separate versions for both RAW and AVC since they have slight color deviations. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested in checking them out. Thanks for listening. I hope they're helpful to your workflow. And that's all I have to say about this camera for now. Overall, I think Canon really has a fantastic package here with the C50. I think it fits nicely into their current lineup, works beautifully as a smaller, cheaper companion to their larger cameras, and produces a terrific image with very few compromises from a consistency and feature perspective. Yes, it is missing some of the hybrid camera comforts like an EVF and IBIS, but again, I think if you leave the job of hybrid camera to the R5 Mark II and look at this one strictly as a compact cinema camera, I think you'll be very happy with what this thing can do. All right, I'm done.